In the deep south, the Whitmore estate stood with quiet arrogance. It wasn't just a home, it was a reminder. A place that carried the weight of lineage, money, and something far less noble. Elijah Brooks had never been intimidated by a house, but as he stepped onto the estate grounds, something inside him braced. It wasn't fear, it was memory. The kind that curled into the bones and warned a man to stay alert, to hold his head high without making himself a target. He came carrying more than just knives and ingredients. He carried the legacy of a woman who once told him that cooking wasn't just a job, it was a voice for those long silenced. Born and raised in New Orleans, Elijah knew flavor the way others knew scripture. He had learned to stir pots before he could write his name. His grandmother's kitchen had been his school, his sanctuary, and his stage. There, among the smell of smoked sausage and thyme, he had memorized not just recipes but stories of survival, of grief, of pride that never bowed. Now at 35 he stood as a seasoned private chef, known for creating magic in silence. He was quiet, by choice and by wisdom, knowing that some rooms only listened to silence. The Whitmore estate had hired him for a one-time private event, a favor called in through someone who didn't mind pretending Elijah was simply convenient. He knew the kind of people he'd be cooking for, and he knew his presence wouldn't be seen as talent, but as service. The kitchen was stunning, cold in its perfection, gleaming with surfaces never touched by hardship. It lacked mess, warmth, and soul, qualities that Elijah brought with him in every dish. As he began preparing the tasting menu, his hands moved with the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times, but his mind drifted to what mattered. More. His daughter, Talia, waiting at home, her breathing shallow but her spirit strong. 10 years old and already too familiar with pain. Elijah worked not for praise or prestige, but for her. Every drop of oil, every sprinkle of seasoning was another step toward the surgery she needed, the one insurance wouldn't cover, the one hospitals placed behind forms and waiting lists. The estate remained quiet until the footsteps began, measured, deliberate, rehearsed. Margaret Whitmore made her entrance not like a hostess, but like a monarch. Everything about her screamed control, from her pressed linen to the way she observed people with a gaze that sorted them before they spoke. She had built her world around the belief that value came with breeding, and that some people existed only to make her comfort seamless. Elijah presented the menu he had crafted, 8 courses drawn from his roots, elevated for refinement, yet steeped in authenticity. Smoked duck resting on cornbread puree, scallops with a Creole glaze, a nod to his culture, not a performance. But it became clear from the first glance that none of it mattered. She dismissed the dishes not because they were lacking, but because they carried something she had never been taught to respect: soul. It wasn't the words themselves that stung, it was the tone. A tone that reminded Elijah of every time someone had spoken around him instead of to him. Every kitchen where he'd been praised for execution but never creativity. Every review that complimented his flavors but questioned his credentials. Every door that opened only halfway. He stood still, absorbing it all in silence, letting the moment wash over him but not define him. His mind, however, drifted backward. He remembered being a boy, carrying a tray of food to a neighbor's house, his grandmother standing proudly behind him. The woman who answered the door took the food, wrinkled her nose, and made a comment not meant for young ears, but heard all the same. That day, Elijah had understood something about how the world viewed people who looked like him. Welcome only when useful. As the tasting ended, Margaret changed the menu entirely. She wanted classics, safe, elegant, stripped of anything unfamiliar. The gumbo was gone. The crawfish was deemed too common. The smoked duck too strong. What remained were dishes without a story. Elijah didn't argue. He simply nodded and took the new list, knowing the game was older than him, and still far from over. Later that evening, after the kitchen had quieted and the estate settled into its rhythm of wealth, Elijah stepped outside and called home. The bim sound of his daughter's voice, though faint, lifted something in him. She didn't ask if he had been treated well. She asked if they had liked his food. Her innocence, her belief in him, reminded him that dignity wasn't a performance for others. It was a promise to self. After the call, Elijah sat alone with the notebook he always carried. Wrapped in fabric faded from years of use, it contained his grandmother's recipes. Not just instructions, but memories. Pages smudged with oil and annotated with thoughts. His fingers paused on one dish in particular, sweet earth gumbo. A dish that told a story in every bite, earthy, spicy, layered with time. A dish that had once fed communities during storms and brought families together after loss. It had been his grandmother's pride, her way of saying, "We are here and we matter." He wasn't supposed to make it. Not tonight, not in this house. But something in him had begun to stir. The part that remembered why he started cooking in the first place. Not for acceptance, not for approval, but for truth. The following day, while preparing the newly approved menu, Elijah made a quiet decision. As he chopped, seared, and reduced according to instruction, he set a small pot aside. Into it went the trinity of Creole cooking: onion, bell pepper, and celery. The scent began to rise. Then came the roux, dark and slow-cooked, okra, tomatoes, sausage, bay leaf, a dish that belonged to no one but him. It was not for the menu. It was for remembrance. When Margaret returned that afternoon for a final tasting, her attention passed swiftly over the carefully prepared dishes. She gave curt approval, offering no warmth. When her eyes found the small pot simmering at the back, she questioned its presence with a frown. Elijah explained that it was nothing official, just a personal preparation, something to keep his hands busy. She dismissed it without a second glance, uninterested in the parts of him that wouldn't fit neatly into her curated world. But he didn't discard it. He kept it warm, letting it sit quietly on the stove like a secret waiting for the right moment. That night, as Charleston's elite filled the estate with champagne and low laughter, Elijah worked silently in the kitchen. Each plate he sent out was flawless, every garnish placed with care. But what lingered in the air wasn't the steak or soufflé. It was the smell from that small pot, bold and unapologetic. Somehow it found its way to the dining room. A single bowl served in error, perhaps by chance, perhaps by fate. It reached. A man who tasted it and paused. The silence that followed was different, not cold, not dismissive, but curious. Then came the whispers, then the questions. By the time the evening ended, someone had asked to meet the chef. Not the help, not the server, the creator. And Elijah, still calm, still quiet, stepped out from the shadows not as someone seeking permission, but as someone who had always belonged at the table. In that moment, everything shifted. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. And the gumbo kept simmering as it always had, waiting for someone ready to taste the truth. Elijah had always known how to read silence, not the quiet of peace, but the stillness that followed judgment. The kind that settled in rooms when people decided who you were before you opened your mouth. He had learned to live within it, not out of comfort, but survival. But after Margaret's biting dismissal of his dishes and her cold gaze slicing through his presence like he was barely worth the air he breathed, something had begun to shift inside him. He spent that night wide awake, lying on the thin mattress, in the estate's servant quarters. The ceiling above him was cracked, the air dry, but the real weight pressing on his chest came from his thoughts. He wondered whether staying silent had made him smaller in their eyes, or whether he had given them permission to keep him small. He thought about all the times he had stood back and let others take credit, believing that maybe his time would come if he was patient enough, humble enough, invisible enough. But patience had never paid his bills, and humility had never paid for Talia's medication. He could hear his grandmother's voice echoing through the silence. The words were soft, yet firm, spoken so many times they had become part of him. They can take your space, Elijah, but they can't take your spirit, unless you hand it to them. Before sunrise, he called home. Talia's voice was raspy, weak from the medication, but it lit something in him. "Did they like your food, Daddy?" she asked. He hesitated. There was a pause, not long enough for her to notice, but long enough to weigh the truth. "I think they just don't know what good food tastes like yet," he replied with a soft laugh. Her giggle, faint and sleepy, made his chest ache. That day, as the staff prepared for the high-profile event, Elijah moved through the kitchen like a man split in two. One part followed orders, plating the dishes Margaret had dictated with robotic perfection. The other part stayed quiet and simmered, beneath the surface like the gumbo he'd dared to prepare in secret. He'd kept it warm, tucked away from view. Just one pot, just one piece of himself. He wasn't supposed to make it, and he definitely wasn't supposed to serve it, but fate rarely asks for permission. As the evening unfolded, the estate buzzed with the hum of Charleston's wealthiest. Servers moved swiftly, glasses clinked. Elijah stayed tucked behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, watching each course leave his hands and enter a world he wasn't meant to be a part of. Then it happened. A single bowl of gumbo, meant for no one, somehow made its way onto the tray. No one noticed, no one questioned. It reached a guest with curious taste, and everything changed in an instant. The man who received the bowl didn't react right away. But after the first bite, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough to draw a glance from the guest beside him. He took another bite, slower this time, as if trying to make sense of what he was tasting. Word spread quickly. Several others asked what the dish was. No one had an answer. It wasn't on the printed menu. A few guests requested to try it. Staff returned to the kitchen asking for that bowl again. Confused murmurs rippled through the dining hall. Some praised the complexity, others admired the soulfulness. But all agreed they hadn't tasted anything like it before. When the estate manager appeared, he wasn't smiling. His expression was tight, his tone clipped. He motioned for Elijah to step out, and for a moment Elijah thought he was about to be reprimanded for going off script. Instead, he was led to the guest who had sparked the buzz. The man introduced himself as Darius Leclerc, a food investor whose ventures ranged from fine dining restaurants in Paris to culinary TV networks. He was used to being impressed, but rarely moved. Yet the dish had stirred something in him, something he couldn't ignore. He wanted to know who had made it. Elijah stood there, dressed in a coat stained with the proof of his labor, hands still warm from the pot, while the room full of tuxedos turned to glance his way. Darius spoke with curiosity and genuine admiration, but the room around him watched Elijah with surprise, as if confused how someone who looked like him could have created something so refined. Margaret joined them quickly, inserting herself with the practiced grace of someone used to redirecting attention. She offered compliments that sounded like ownership, referring to Elijah as the help she had brought in last minute. She praised herself for recognizing his potential, twisting the narrative as if she had been his mentor rather than his oppressor. Elijah stood still, listening to her spin control around him like silk threads. But he didn't challenge her. He didn't correct her. Not yet. Instead, he answered Darius with calm respect. He said that the dish came from his grandmother's book, that it was part of his story, not just his skill. Later, Darius requested a private dinner the next evening to experience more of Elijah's food. Margaret agreed eagerly, seeing opportunity in the connection. She smiled politely, all while calculating her next move. She had no intention of letting Elijah rise without reminding him who had given him the platform. After the guests left and the night quieted, she approached Elijah privately. She didn't thank him. She didn't apologize for dismissing his dishes. Instead, she handed him a draft contract, an offer she claimed was generous for someone in his position. The terms were clear. She would take full ownership of all the recipes presented during the dinner. His pay would be modest, but consistent. He would be introduced as a chef trained under her direction, and she would retain all rights to public-facing materials and media. The words weren't just insulting, they were suffocating. The contract stripped him of credit, of identity, of everything he had poured into his food. It didn't recognize his artistry. It attempted to absorb it. As he held the paper in his hands, Elijah felt the return of a familiar heaviness, the weight of systemic exclusion disguised as opportunity. The same pattern that had followed him through his career: unaffordable culinary schools where students like him were tokens, prestigious kitchens where he cooked without being named, and reviews that labeled his work ethnic, as if it were a flaw. He remembered applying for a sous chef role at a Michelin-rated restaurant years ago. He'd prepared 5 dishes, all rooted in Southern tradition, but elevated with international technique. The head chef had complimented the flavor, but said they were too soulful for our audience. Another time, he had been hired by a resort in Savannah, only to find out he'd been brought in to prepare background meals for the real chefs to plate. Every step had felt like walking uphill with no shoes, and every win came with a compromise. But this time was different. This time someone had tasted his truth without knowing his face, and they had loved it. Elijah didn't sign the contract, not right away. He folded it gently and placed it in his bag. He knew better than to tear it up. He knew better than to show defiance too soon. But something inside him was already stirring. Not rage, not rebellion. Something deeper. Something earned. Dignity. He had played by the rules long enough. He had kept his head down, his voice low, and his name hidden behind the menu. But now, someone had seen his work without the filter of bias, without knowing his title, without needing to approve of his background first. And that changed everything. As he prepared for the private dinner Darius had requested, he didn't ask permission. He didn't second guess. He returned to the recipes that had shaped him. Dishes with depth, plates with memory. Every ingredient measured with purpose. Every bite meant to reclaim space. Margaret continued to parade herself as the benefactor. She dropped hints to her guests about discovering a rising star. She curated the evening to feel like her triumph, but Elijah no longer belonged to that story. He was writing his own. And while Margaret tried to hold the pen, Elijah had already found the ink. The contract remained folded in Elijah's bag, untouched, unsigned but heavy all the same. It represented everything he had fought against and yet everything he was supposed to accept. There was money in it, money he needed, money that could help his daughter breathe easier, sleep through the night, without pain, and one day walk without worry. But there was something else tied to it too, a silence, a surrender. Elijah stood at the edge of the cemetery before dawn, hands in his coat pockets, breath curling in the cold morning air. The ground was still damp from last night's rain. He didn't come here often, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't always bear it. Yet today, something pulled him here. Her grave was simple, just a small stone beneath an old tree. No fancy carvings, no grand epitaphs, just her name and the years she'd lived and loved. He stood in silence, his eyes locked on the ground. The wind rustled the branches above, as if she was still speaking to him, not with words but with memory. He closed his eyes and remembered her voice, not loud, not sharp, but steady, the kind that made you feel safe and seen. You always told me to serve them with fire, he thought. Tonight, I will. That evening, the estate came alive once again. Cars pulled up one after another. Valets rushed about. Champagne glasses clinked before the first words were exchanged. Margaret moved through the crowd with ease, polished in pearls and stories. She greeted guests like a conductor greeting her orchestra, every note rehearsed, every smile strategic. Darius arrived in a tailored suit, quiet confidence in his step, genuine curiosity in his eyes. He didn't come for Margaret's charm or her curated perfection. He came for something that had stirred him to feel, and in his world, that was rare. Elijah was already in the kitchen. He didn't speak much, but his hands did. Each dish he prepared carried more than flavor. It carried years. Years of learning without a teacher. Years of being told what he did wasn't gourmet enough, refined enough, neutral enough. This time he wasn't trying to fit in. He was making something that fit him. 7 courses, each one a piece of his history. The first plate carried the smoky comfort of home, infused with the boldness his grandmother taught him to never water down. The second was softer, inspired by the days when all they had were scraps. But they made them taste like a feast. The third was a fusion, Southern roots meeting French technique, a statement that he didn't need permission to innovate. And then there was the fifth dish, the one he had wrestled with all week. He called it the help. It was an elevated, deconstructed version of a dish his grandmother had once made for a white family she cleaned for, an old Southern casserole, reimagined into something delicate, artful, unignorable. On the surface, it looked elegant. But every bite carried a quiet defiance, a reclaiming of a story that was never meant to be honored. As the final plate made its way to the guests, a hush settled in the room. People didn't just eat, they listened. They looked at each other between bites, searching for the words to explain what they were feeling. Margaret stood near the front of the room, beaming. She told stories about her chef, about how she had discovered a diamond in the rough, a quiet talent that only needed the right hand to polish it. She spoke as if Elijah were her product, her success. And that's when he stepped forward. No announcement, no invitation, just presence. The room turned. At first it was surprise, then stillness. Elijah stood tall, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his apron. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't command the room. He simply let the truth walk out with him. He began to speak, not in defense, but in declaration. Each dish, he explained, came from somewhere deeper than culinary school or modern trends. They came from nights spent watching his grandmother stir pots with tired arms and hopeful eyes. From the kitchens where he was told he wasn't marketable. From the journals he filled with ideas while being overlooked. Each plate was a reminder that his culture, his people, and his story had value, regardless of whether the world had recognized it. Then he explained the dish called the help. He didn't name names. He didn't point fingers, but the message was loud enough for anyone listening. He spoke of how food had long been a silent servant in Southern homes, how people like his grandmother had cooked in the shadows while their names were never spoken, their recipes never written down, how those meals raised generations, built businesses and held families together, but were never allowed to sit at the table where they were served. He paused, then turned slightly toward Margaret, not in anger, but with clarity. She had no words. Her lips parted, then closed again. The room was too quiet to pretend anymore. Darius stood, eyes fixed on Elijah, and spoke not just to him, but to the room. He wanted to partner with him, not just for one event, not just for a feature. He wanted to build something honest, rooted, and led by Elijah. The offer hung in the air, full of weight. Elijah took a moment before responding. He thanked Darius, but then, without breaking gaze, he turned to Margaret. "You called me the help," he said. "But help doesn't just serve food, it teaches you how to survive without asking. It builds families. It carries legacy. I'm not your servant. I'm my people's chef." No one applauded. No one needed to. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't argue. She didn't smile. For the first time that evening, she stood without her mask of charm. The power she had wielded for so long, through words, wealth, and control, had slipped quietly from her hands. Elijah returned to the kitchen not as help, not as hired hands, but as the author of the story now unfolding in front of everyone. And in that kitchen, where pots still steamed and spices filled the air, he smiled, not for recognition, but for freedom. The grand opening day had come, but it didn't feel grand. In the way Elijah had imagined as a child, there were no fireworks, no flashing cameras, just a soft hum in the air, the scent of fresh herbs and roasted vegetables slipping through the doors, and the gentle rhythm of something new being born. The sign above the entrance read, "Heritage," carved from reclaimed wood, polished by hand, and placed there with purpose. The name wasn't chosen for style. It was chosen for meaning, because what Elijah had built wasn't just a restaurant, It was a homecoming, a space for stories once overlooked, for flavors once dismissed, and for people once called the help to now stand at the center. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, not of celebrities or critics, but of Black culinary pioneers, cooks who had fed families in times of struggle, chefs whose names were never printed on menus, but whose food shaped generations. And, in the largest frame, placed with quiet reverence, was a photo of his grandmother, her hands resting on a worn wooden spoon, her eyes as calm as a Sunday morning. Beneath her picture, etched in gold, were her words, "Serve them with fire." Elijah walked through the kitchen nodding at his staff, young, focused, diverse. Some were fresh out of culinary school, others had never set foot in one. But all of them had been chosen not just for their skills, but for their stories. He had created scholarships specifically for Black culinary students, those who had been told they'd never make it in fine dining unless they changed who they were. Now they cooked boldly, freely, without shame or permission. In the dining room, Talia wiped down the menus with a soft smile on her face. She had grown stronger since the surgery. Her breathing was easier, her steps lighter. She wasn't just his reason anymore. She was his rhythm. She moved through the restaurant with familiarity, not as a child in recovery, but as someone who knew she belonged here. The restaurant was full that evening, not just with people, but with energy. Laughter echoed against the wood beams. Strangers shared dishes. Conversations danced across tables. And in the center of it all, Elijah stood, without needing to be announced. He was no longer a man behind the curtain. He was the soul of the room. Later that night, as the guests began to leave and the air turned softer, Elijah stepped up to a small platform in the back of the restaurant. The staff gathered. Some guests stayed, sensing something meaningful was about to be said. He looked around, not for applause, but for connection. "I used to believe," he began slowly, "that my work only mattered when someone else said it did. That if I kept my head down long enough, I'd be seen. But I learned something." He paused, the room quiet. "They thought I was just the help, but I was always helping myself. And now, I help others rise." The room didn't erupt in cheers. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was filled with respect, with understanding, with pride. Miles away, in the quiet halls of the Whitmore estate, the television flickered in an otherwise dim room. Margaret sat alone, a glass in her hand, her eyes fixed on the screen as a news segment played highlights from the grand opening of Heritage. The reporter spoke of Elijah Brooks, how he had transformed the culinary landscape with dishes rooted in history, served with a side of justice. The screen showed images of the restaurant, the guests, the team, and finally a slow zoom on the dish called The Help. The anchor's voice noted the irony, that the most talked about plate in the country had been born in a kitchen where it wasn't welcome. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't change the channel. She simply stared, her mouth drawn into a thin. No amount of denial could rewrite what had happened. The estate was no longer just a monument of old money. It was now known as the place where $1 billion dish was born, but not hers. Elijah's name now echoed in places she couldn't reach. His story had moved beyond her walls, her control, her world. Back in New Orleans, the restaurant stayed open late that night. The staff laughed as they cleaned. Music played low, and Elijah stood by the kitchen doorway, watching it all unfold. He didn't need to say anything else. The food had already spoken, and this time it spoke for everyone who had ever been told to stay silent.